Marcus Reed had never imagined that a single Monday morning could change his entire life. At 8:17 a.m., he stood inside Richard Coleman's large corner office, staring at a termination letter that seemed impossible to understand. The words "performance concerns" were printed clearly across the page. But Marcus knew something was wrong. For nearly 8 years, he had been one of the most dependable employees in the company. He arrived before most of his co-workers, stayed late when deadlines were approaching, and often stepped in when someone else failed to complete an important task. He had received positive reviews, helped train new employees, and had even been praised by Richard only a few months earlier for saving an important client account. Yet now, Richard sat behind his expensive desk, looking at Marcus as though their years of working together meant nothing. "You're fired, Marcus," Richard said coldly. "Security will walk you out." Marcus remained silent for several seconds, trying to understand what he had just heard. He finally looked down at the letter and then back at his boss. "What did I do?" he asked. Richard leaned back in his chair and gave a tired sigh. "This isn't about what you did. It's about what the company needs." Marcus knew that answer did not make sense. If the company needed better performance, he had the records to prove that he had delivered it. If they needed loyalty, he had given them almost 8 years of his life. But Marcus also knew that arguing would not change Richard's decision. He slowly folded the termination letter and placed it in his pocket. "Okay," he said quietly. Richard looked almost surprised by how calm he was. "That's it," Marcus nodded. "What else am I supposed to say?" He turned around and walked toward the door. Every step felt heavier than the one before. As he left the office, he passed co-workers who avoided his eyes because they did not know what to say. Marcus had no idea how he would explain the situation to his 6-year-old daughter, Amara. She was waiting for him at home, depending on him for everything from school lunches to bedtime stories. He had promised her that they would always be okay. But as Marcus stepped outside the building with no job and no immediate plan, he realized that for the first time, keeping that promise was going to be harder than ever, and he could not yet see what was waiting for him beyond that difficult morning. That afternoon, Marcus picked up his 6-year-old daughter, Amara, from school earlier than usual, trying his best to hide the worry on his face. The moment she climbed into the car, she noticed that something was different. "Daddy, are you okay?" she asked, looking at him through the rear-view mirror. Marcus forced a small smile and nodded. "I'm okay, sweetheart. I just had a change at work." Amara was quiet for a moment before asking the question he had been hoping she would not ask. "Are you still going to work tomorrow?" Marcus tightened his hands around the steering wheel and took a slow breath. "Not at that job," he finally said. Her expression changed immediately. "Did they fire you?" Marcus nodded. Amara looked down at her hands, and Marcus could see that she was trying to understand what this meant for their little family. After a few seconds, she asked softly, "Are we going to be okay?" That question stayed with Marcus all evening. He reached back and held her hand. "Yes," he said firmly, "we are going to be okay." Later that night, after Amara had gone to sleep, Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table with his laptop open in front of him. The apartment was completely quiet, except for the soft sound of the refrigerator. He checked his bank account and immediately felt a knot in his stomach. He had rent coming soon, school expenses for Amara, groceries to buy, and several other bills that could not simply wait because he had lost his job. Marcus rubbed his face and reminded himself that panic would not solve anything. He opened a job website and began searching. He applied for an operations position, then another management position, and then several other jobs that matched his experience. By midnight, he had submitted 11 applications. He was exhausted, but he refused to give up. Just as he was about to close his laptop, his phone suddenly began ringing. Marcus looked at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. For a moment, he considered ignoring it because it was already late. Then he answered. "Hello." A woman's voice came through the phone. "Is this Marcus Reed?" Marcus sat up straight. "Yes, this is Marcus. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm calling from Northbridge Consulting. We received your application." Marcus immediately became more alert. He had applied to Northbridge earlier that evening, but he never expected anyone to call so quickly. "You're calling about the operations manager position?" he asked. "Yes," Evelyn replied, "but I'm actually calling for another reason too." Marcus frowned slightly, wondering what she could possibly mean, while on the other end of the phone Evelyn prepared to tell him that someone inside the company already knew his name and remembered exactly what he had accomplished years earlier, before Marcus had any idea that the job he desperately needed could be connected to the person who was about to change his entire future. Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing when Evelyn Carter explained that someone at Northbridge Consulting remembered his name. 5 years earlier, before Marcus had joined Richard Coleman's company, he had worked on a complicated logistics project that involved several businesses, including Northbridge. At the time, Marcus had been one of the few employees who noticed a serious problem in the supply chain. Several shipments were being delayed, costs were increasing, and important clients were beginning to complain. Instead of ignoring the issue or blaming another department, Marcus spent several nights studying the records and eventually discovered a mistake that could have cost the company millions of dollars. He immediately reported what he had found and helped the team correct the problem. One of the executives who had worked closely with him was David Carter, the founder of Northbridge Consulting. David had been impressed by Marcus's honesty, patience, and ability to solve problems under pressure. Although years had passed since that project, David had never forgotten him. When Evelyn mentioned Marcus's name, David recognized it almost immediately. The next morning, Marcus received an invitation for an interview. He arrived at Northbridge wearing the best suit he owned, carrying a folder filled with his work history and recommendations. He expected a normal interview, but the meeting quickly became something completely different. Evelyn asked him about his previous experience, his management style, and how he handled difficult situations. Marcus answered honestly, never exaggerating his achievements. After nearly 2 hours, Evelyn told him that another person wanted to speak with him. The door opened, and David Carter walked into the room. Marcus stood immediately. "Mr. Carter," he said, surprised. David smiled warmly. "Marcus, I've been hoping we would cross paths again." They shook hands, and David invited him to sit down. "I heard what happened at your company," David said. Marcus looked confused. "You know about that already?" David nodded. "We know more than you might think." He placed a folder on the table and opened it. Inside were documents related to Marcus's former employer, including performance reviews, client correspondence, and financial reports. Marcus recognized several of the documents immediately. David explained that Northbridge had been considering acquiring a major division of Richard's company for months. During that process, their team had noticed something unusual. Several important clients repeatedly mentioned Marcus by name and expressed concern after learning that he had been fired. They described him as reliable, honest, and one of the few people they trusted to solve problems quickly. Marcus slowly realized that the termination he had considered a disaster had created a completely unexpected opportunity. Meanwhile, back at Richard's company, problems were beginning to appear everywhere. Clients who had depended on Marcus were demanding answers, reports were being delayed, and several contracts were suddenly being reviewed, while Richard still believed Marcus had been nothing more than an employee he could easily replace. Meanwhile, Richard Coleman was beginning to realize that firing Marcus had been a much bigger mistake than he first imagined. On the morning after Marcus left, Richard walked into the office expecting everything to continue as usual. He had convinced himself that Marcus was simply another employee who could be replaced. But before Richard had even finished his first cup of coffee, his assistant walked into the office with a worried expression. "Richard, we have a problem with the Henderson account," she said. Richard looked up from his computer. "What kind of problem?" She explained that the client wanted an immediate meeting because several reports Marcus had been handling were suddenly delayed. Richard frowned and told her to give the work to another manager. He assumed the issue would disappear. It didn't. By the afternoon, another major client had contacted the company and asked why Marcus was no longer involved with their account. Then a third client requested a review of its contract. Richard began receiving messages from senior executives asking why so many important relationships were becoming unstable at the same time. For years, Marcus had quietly handled problems before they became emergencies, maintained relationships with difficult clients, and kept projects moving without demanding recognition. Richard had mistaken Marcus's calm personality for weakness. Now, without him, the gaps were becoming impossible to ignore. Richard tried calling Marcus, but Marcus did not answer. He sent an email asking him to return to the office for a discussion. Marcus read the message, but chose not to respond. He was already focused on his interview with Northbridge, and on building a future for himself and Amara. A few days later, Richard received an announcement that left him speechless. Northbridge Consulting was acquiring the division he managed. Richard rushed into an emergency meeting, demanding an explanation from the company's executives. The CEO placed several documents on the table and explained that the acquisition had been under consideration for months. Richard insisted that the company could not sell the division without his approval. But the CEO calmly reminded him that the decision had already been made. Then Richard noticed another document on the table. It contained a proposed leadership structure for the division. His eyes moved down the page until they stopped on one name: Marcus Reed. Richard stared at the document as if the letters might somehow change. "No?" he whispered. The CEO looked at him. "Yes, Richard." Richard suddenly understood why Northbridge had been so interested in Marcus. He had thought he was firing an ordinary employee, but he had actually pushed away someone who had earned the trust of major clients and attracted the attention of a powerful business leader. Richard tried to defend himself by claiming Marcus had performance problems, but the CEO already had copies of Marcus's evaluations, which showed consistently strong results. Then David Carter entered the meeting and calmly asked Richard why he had terminated one of the company's most valuable employees without proper justification, while Richard struggled to find an answer that could explain how he had turned his own decision into the reason he was about to lose control of everything he had worked to build. Marcus walked into his new office on his first morning as the operations director with a mixture of disbelief and determination. Just a short time earlier, he had been sitting alone at his kitchen table, worried about how he would pay the bills after losing his job. Now he was standing inside a spacious office overlooking the same division that had once seemed like the end of his career. He placed his briefcase beside the desk and took out a small photograph of his daughter, Amara. He carefully placed it on the corner of the desk and smiled. Everything he had done since that difficult Monday morning had been for her. David Carter entered the office a few minutes later and congratulated him on his new position. Marcus thanked him, but made it clear that he did not want to spend his first day celebrating someone else's failure. He wanted to prove that he deserved the opportunity. David respected that attitude and told Marcus that leadership was not about having the biggest office or the highest salary. It was about how a person treated others when they finally had power. Marcus took those words seriously. Instead of immediately changing everything, he spent his first weeks listening to employees. He spoke with managers, assistants, warehouse workers, customer service representatives, and people who had worked at the company for years without ever being noticed by senior leadership. He discovered that many employees were afraid to speak openly because they believed one mistake could cost them their jobs. Marcus decided that would change. He introduced clearer promotion policies so employees would know exactly what they needed to accomplish to move forward. He created an emergency assistance program for workers facing unexpected financial problems. He also required managers to document performance concerns fairly. Instead of using vague explanations to remove employees they simply did not like. One afternoon, Marcus received a message from Richard. Richard wanted to meet. Marcus agreed, but only because he believed people deserved an opportunity to take responsibility for their actions. When they met, Richard looked very different from the confident man who had once sat behind the expensive office desk. He admitted that he had underestimated Marcus and had assumed that Marcus had nowhere else to go. Marcus listened quietly. He could have used the moment to insult him or remind him of everything he had lost, but he chose another path. "I hope you learn from what happened," Marcus said. "Not just because of me, but because there are people working for you who may be carrying struggles you know nothing about." Richard lowered his eyes. Marcus understood that revenge would not change the past. Success had already answered the question Richard asked when he fired him. That's it. It wasn't. It was only the beginning. Months later, Marcus stood before hundreds of employees at a leadership event and shared the story of the morning. He lost everything he thought he needed. He explained how one decision had forced him to discover opportunities he had never imagined. Then he looked toward the audience and said that people should never be judged by their background, their appearance, or a difficult season in their lives, because sometimes the person being overlooked is the very person who could eventually become the strongest leader in the room. The person whose quiet determination can turn rejection into opportunity, and whose greatest success can begin on the exact day someone else decides they are not valuable enough to keep.